In this consumer society in which we live,
we're taught to function,
to consume, and to keep consuming mechanically, manipulated with a single purpose:
to make money.
Now the question is, do we want to continue being functional in this wicked system? Fill the Void is a concept and a critical thinking community. We seek to raise awareness about the importance of mental and emotional health in our community. Do you feel empty in your day-to-day life, or that you can't find a way?
Don't worry.
You're not alone. Fill the Void exposes the symptoms of our society. Our Fill the Void ecosystem aims to inspire a cultural change for well-being so that we can learn to live more satisfactorily. To show how we fill the void in our daily lives, we have developed a series of pills. Each one addresses that void we have since the day we are born. Welcome to Fill the Void podcast, where we dive into the void and discuss human habits caused by the society of consumption. Welcome everyone to Fill the Void podcast. I'm very excited because today I have an amazing, incredible guest, Daniel Vitalis. He is the host of Wild Fed on Outdoor Channel, and as a successful entrepreneur, he founded the nutrition company Surthrival in 2008. He was the host of the popular podcast Rewild Yourself, and most recently, the Wild Fed podcast. And he's especially interested in helping people reconnect with the wilderness, both from inside and the outside. How are you, Daniel? Welcome to Fill the Void.
Thanks for having me. I'm doing great.
Amazing. So to start, I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself. Like, what's your story and how did it all start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, like you mentioned, right now I make a television show for Outdoor Channel, which is a culinary adventure series. So we hunt, fish, and forage for wild foods, and then we bring those back to chefs or sometimes to my own kitchen, prepare meals, and then we kind of gather everyone around that meal. And it's really important to me to connect with nature and to connect with wildness. And I think a lot of that has to do with how I grew up. So, I grew up in New England, mostly in New Hampshire, but also in Maine, where I live now, and had a kind of a traumatic childhood. And life was really difficult as a young person. And as a result, my prospects were pretty limited, and took a very alternative path through the world. Most of the people that I grew up with had really bad outcomes, unfortunately. So a lot of people kind of spun off into addiction, into prison, dying, suicides, things like that.
And can you talk a little bit more about all their trauma? Because that's also the point, why I do my podcast, because I've also been through some kind of these things, and I love talking and normalizing about the problems because we all have them, and there's a lot of stigma around these things, right, even still nowadays.
It's interesting because in my life today I get to meet a lot of people who are positioned really well in society, but it seems like everybody's got someone in their family who's an addict, or someone in their life who's an abuser, or somebody who in their life who's been abused, or they were themselves. And I do think this kind of stuff does touch everybody. It's very human, but it's understandably also stuff we don't always want to air. And so I get both sides of that. But so I grew up, a poverty level, on welfare programs and things like that, but also around mental illness and addiction. So the poverty piece, so that's living in a bad area, that's eating bad food, that's having instability, in your day-to-day life. The mental illness part was more traumatic, though, I think. I think people are very robust. Obviously, we can handle a lot of difficulty. In fact, it's probably good for us to have some difficulty. The mental illness piece was more traumatic for me because I grew up around a single mom who had a lot of personal instability, a lot of depression and manic episodes, going away to treatments, psychological, kind of pharmacological drugs, and then just really hard to understand stories about alien abduction and crazy religion things and things that really twist your mind up. So as a young person, it took me a long time to unravel a lot of that. I think I'm still unraveling a lot of it. You know, I grew up with a kind of attitude of like, why do anything? It's the end of the world. That was what my mom really imparted on me. It's like the aliens are coming back with Jesus and the angels.
Very existential. Yes.
Yeah. I think you just kind of nailed it really well. I grew up with a kind of psychologically sophisticated existential trauma that to this day, I'm interested in things that I have a very difficult time finding other people that are interested in, because I started thinking about existential issues very young in a way similar to someone, let's say somebody who's been sexualized really young. So somebody is maybe molested or something as a young person, and now they're thinking about sex 10 years before their peers.
Yeah.
And now when they're in their 20s, their sex life is advanced really beyond their peers in a way that isn't really meant to be. And so similarly, I think in if I can draw a parallel, I know they're really different, but it's like I was as a result of how I grew up, I was wrestling with existential issues very young. And they're not all the issues that I'm talking about, they're real things, you know? So it's not that, hey, you shouldn't think about these things. It's that young people don't need to think about those things, but they're real things. And so, you know, they're not all things I want to just discard. They're things I still wrestle with today, but I also notice that a lot of my peers live in a kind of, there's like a bliss to the ignorance of not thinking about those kind of issues too. And
exactly, numbing yourself. It's like numbing yourself to not feel these things,
or to not be exposed to them in the first place too. Which so maybe like somebody who another parallel would be like somebody goes off to war, and what they see there is real. That's real stuff. So it's not like you come back and you go, oh, because here we're all like, we don't live with that day to day. So we think, hey man, like let it go. That's behind you. And they're like, do you understand what the world is really like? And we're like, that's not what the world's really like. But actually, parts of the world really are like that. So it's not that you just let it all go, because that's real. So I think that's one of the challenges with trauma, because when we're traumatized, we get exposed to things that are real parts of humanity, just not parts that everyone else has necessarily been exposed to. So, so I was out of my house really young. I started living on, the street, when I was about 12 years old. And that forced me to really have to think about how I would take care of myself, from real basic, like food, like how do you eat? And that, that led me to have a strong interest in food, because it was
surviving. Like, you were like in survival mode all the time.
Yeah, for sure I was. But my mind, from, I think, again, wrestling with those existential issues, I had a sophisticated interest in food, and that led me to really kind of chase that down. So over time, that idea of like, hey, what should I feed myself, turned into the question of, hey, what are people supposed to eat? Because I was looking around like, man, this doesn't make sense. It was like, individual sliced cheese in the plastic, and like boxes of things. And it's like, this can't be what we're supposed to eat. So I became very fascinated by food. And where I lived, there would be, people would have maybe an apple tree or a peach tree, and every time I would pick something like that, I'd be like, this is it. This is like real food, This feels like what I should be after. So I became really interested in like foraging berries and things like that. Not because I was starving and needed to, but because I thought this must be human food. And the way that, we understand with other animals, it's like any animal that we take an interest in, I could go grab off my bookshelf there, like the Audubon Society's guide, and we could look up that animal, and there'll be a section on the diet. And we'll go, hey, this is what that animal eats. It's like real, like, to make it really simple would be like, pick something that eats the same thing. Like a panda bear eats bamboo, right? So I could just go, and there's the diet, and it's like, so there's the entry, bamboo. When you're talking about people, there's nowhere to go look for that. It's like, what do people eat? Well, we just eat everything. We eat processed food. So I started to chase this idea of what's human food. Again, born out of that, like having to learn how to feed myself became an interest. And I started to realize that there wasn't any easy answers around. It was very complex and confusing.
Yeah, even now I think about it, and I'm like, there's so many diets, there's so many ways. Like, what's the correct way? How? Like, it depends on the body, it depends on the person.
Yeah, but it's interesting too because, and I'm not disagreeing. I actually do agree with you. So somebody might say, "Hey, Daniel, you're from the Mediterranean, so you should eat a Mediterranean diet." And my native friends from North America, well, they should eat bison and maize because they're from here. But it's interesting with other animals, we don't do that. So I'm not like, well, squirrels on the East Coast should eat this and squirrels on the West Coast should eat that. We just go like, this is what squirrels eat. But with
Yeah, yeah.
people, it gets all fine detail and complicated, But anyway, all to say, I chased that idea of food to, and for clarity for people listening, particularly millennials and Gen Z folks, because I'm a Gen Xer. So when I was a kid, there wasn't Whole Foods. In fact, when I was a kid, there wasn't, and when I say a kid, I'm talking about I was about 16. There wasn't even like organic certification didn't exist yet. So there wasn't organic food. Like if you said organic food when I was 16, no one knew what that meant. That wasn't a thing. So it was the very, very early days. I grew up in the very early days of the food revolution that we're now living in the prime of, because this has all happened
Yes,
now, right? So
exactly.
now you can go into a Whole Foods the size of a Walmart and you're just inundated with endless products, but it was not like that. So the health food stores at that time were very small. They might be the size of someone's bedroom, and they would
Wow.
have like 20 items in there, stuff that you would not even think is healthy today. A lot of old dry grains and things like that, dates, a handful of items, soy, protein, things like that. And I watched this whole thing unfold and got to be part of the unfolding of this current food paradigm. So I just kept following that. Got interested in organic food when that first started. Watched the advent of farmers markets as they came back into favor, because there was just a whole period of time where there weren't any farmers markets.
Yeah.
That wasn't, again, like there used to be, and there are now, but there was a window of time where everything was boxed processed food.
That's correct.
Today, I know so many farmers, I know so many young people farmers, but that also didn't exist at the time. It was very, very, very uncommon. So all this unfolded, and I kept chasing that interest. And eventually, I realized what domestication was and means, which I could get into in a bit.
Yes, I want to hear about that.
I would
I'm
like to
very
talk
interested.
about that. And that led me to an interest in wild foods, because I realized, hey, we've only been domesticating the foods that we eat. Grains in the form of wheat and barley or corn or rice, vegetables like we eat, broccoli, kale, collard, onion, animals that we eat, cows, pigs, sheep, goats. We've only been domesticating them for about 10,000 years, but humans are been around a lot longer. So clearly there was this very long stretch of our history where we didn't eat these domesticated foods, and only a very short period of time where we have been eating those foods. So to answer my initial question, what's human food supposed to be? Well, we have to look before domesticated foods.
I was going to ask, what is before domesticated foods?
Yeah, but the thing is if we go into the supermarket, almost every single food in there is a domesticated food. So to go back to what you said a moment ago, there's so many diets. Well, what's funny is all those diets are just reassemblages of the same suite of domesticated species.
Yes.
So what you're doing is like you go into the supermarket and one diet says, oh, no, only these foods. And the next diet goes, no, those foods are bad. Only these foods.
Other. Yes.
And it's none of those foods, because those are all novel new foods. Not to say that none of those foods are good. I eat a lot of those foods, of course. We all do. But the answer can't lie in the supermarket, because none of those foods are found in nature. So again, like you and I could go hiking all day long. We're not going to find a wild cow. We're not going to find a wild potato. We're not going to find any wild broccoli, because none of that stuff exists out there. And the best way to bring that in, well, we'll come back to that. I just want to finish the thought, because you would ask me sort of how I got here. So,
yes.
So I just kept chasing that idea. So I went from, the boxed supermarket processed food to, cleaner food, whole food, to organic food, to farmers market food, then to saying, hey, where do farmers get these species? And that led me to an interest in wild food, which sort of, jump ahead 30 years. And now I make a TV show about wild food. And the big picture for me isn't that anymore, I should say, because there was a time in my life where I thought maybe I could eat my way to immortality or salvation, or, like I think a lot of people go down that road. Like this diet's going to fix all my problems.
Yes.
And the problems aren't necessarily in your gut. Most of them are in your head, and food's not going to fix that. But and it can be a tremendous help, but it's not going to fix that. And if you chase that demon too long, you'll actually develop a whole bunch of other new problems, like orthorexic problems, where you're so food obsessed that you can make your life toxic and you can lose your relationships. And I mean, a lot of people for sure know people.
I
in the
know what
vegan
you're
community.
saying. Yeah, because
You see in the
I've been
vegan
through
community, you
like,
see in the raw food community.
yeah, vegan community or whatever, even if you get a lot into fitness, like you get so obsessed around food, it
Yeah.
even happened to me, that you can't go and enjoy a meal with friends or
Right.
anything. Like it really affects your life.
Yeah, so I think that's the other end of the spectrum, because you got one end of the spectrum that's like, I'm ignorant, I don't know anything about it. The other end of the spectrum is I know too much about it, and I'm losing the forest for the trees here. So obsessed with the thing. And I went all the way that way too.
Yeah.
But now where I'm at in my life, because I'm 45 now, and I've been chasing this theme for a very long time. Now I see it more as a way to connect people to something real. Because when you plug somebody into some foraging or some hunting or even just time in nature, even just awareness of what wildness is, because we're at this era where people are about to go into truly artificial
Yeah.
living, right? So, and actually beyond artificial.
Disconnection. Complete
Disconnection into like a digital metaverse. And my concern is, like, right now, if somebody puts on like a VR headset, they're going to take that off later on and they're going to be back in the real world. But that's now. Kind of like, if you remember, I remember when the first cell phones came out, you didn't use it very much. Almost never. Now, it's very hard to put it down. Even if you're somebody who's aware that you shouldn't be using it so much, not to mention people who don't even think about that. So you can imagine a day where people spend less time in the real world than in the artificial digital world.
I'm scared about that.
I think a lot of us have our eyes open right now, because it doesn't. The thing is, it'd be one thing if every aspect of our digital experience felt positive, but most of it feels kind of negative. So when you feel like a darkness around it, it's like, well, why would we want more of this? But then you look around and society's like, no, this is the best thing ever. We need more.
Yes,
faster.
we need more.
And you're like,
more.
Are we ever going to vote on any of this? Like, are we ever going to talk about any of this? Like, we're just doing. It's sort of like, to me, I think about when you see something like they released all the genetically modified mosquitoes in Florida, for instance, where you're like, into the wild, you just released like, when were we going to ever talk about this? Is there any, do we have any vote in this? Like, what do you mean you did that? Or any number of things like that, you know? What we learned about was going on in some of the viral programs, for instance, you know, with, that all came out recently, right? So we sort of saw, oh, you're not just tinkering with viruses, but you're giving them new capabilities. Like, whoa. And technologies like that, it's like, we're just developing. Like, I don't feel like we get a vote. We're about to have internet everywhere you go. So I go off to make my TV show in remote places. Like, I'm used to having no service. Pretty soon there's going to be Wi-Fi everywhere because they're putting these satellite constellations in the sky. And it's like, we have no idea how ubiquitous all this stuff's about to become. It's going to be everywhere. So for me, plugging people into nature is a way of making sure that they maintain, or at least helping people to find a way to maintain a connection. Because I think that there's a beautiful intelligence behind the natural world. The design of it is so incredible that it makes me very aware of a higher power. But when you're in the digital space, it's all man-made. So what's the higher power? Who's the creator of that? Well, it's other people. And that, to me, is as degenerating to our spiritual life as processed food is to our physical body, if that makes sense.
Exactly. Like, being in touch with nature is our source of, like, humankind also. That's the way to be spiritual. I really resonate with what you're saying.
Yeah, so when I first talking about wild foods, I think some people think, oh, this guy's into nutrition, or, oh, this guy's into the outdoors. And it's like, yeah, I love both of those things, but it's a much bigger picture thing for me, because when I zoom out and try to look at what's happening to humanity, I feel like we're being sort of corralled into something that's antithetical to our spirit, to our bodies, to the lifestyle most of us want to live, but we're all doing it and we're going along with it.
Exactly.
And so I love the like if you watch the movie or read the book The Hunger Games, where Katniss is like sneaks out to hunt, gets through the hole in the fence to go out to hunt.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I see hunting and fishing and foraging like. It's like, hey, we're not really supposed to, but you could still get out in nature while we get out there while you can, because it's very meaningful. And people who do it, most of us, it's about a lot more than just the food or the hobby.
Yeah. And can you go back to the concept that you were explaining before of the, like, going back from the kale, all this food that we have in the supermarket?
Yeah, about the domestication.
That, yes.
Yeah.
That term. And
Sure.
I like that term in also because of food, but like humans, we are domesticated as well, because I was thinking, like, you just said we are like all together in a corral as domesticated animals.
Yeah. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and trying to research, are human beings, should we be considered a domesticated species? And I think the answer is actually yes, and I'll break that down. So here's how I like to explain domestication to people. I like to use dogs. I think they're a great example because we all know some dogs.
Yes,
and
I have a dog.
What kind of dog do you have?
A pit bull mixed with lab.
Okay, great. It's a great example because if you look at let's say a pit bull alone, a lab, a little different. But if I look at a pit bull, I do not see the wild progenitor there. But the wild progenitor of the pit bull is the gray wolf. So the wolf, everybody knows, the Arctic part of the world, that circumpolar animal, the wolf, dogs are wolves. So you have some breeds of dogs where you clearly can see it. It's like if you look at a German Shepherd or any of the sled dogs, like Alaskan Malamutes or Huskies, you're like, that looks like a wolf. But then you also have dogs like Shih Tzus and Chihuahuas where bulldogs, where you look at them and you're like, man, that does not look like a wolf anymore. It's been radically changed, but it is still a wolf. So in science, the gray wolf is known as Canis lupus, and the dog is known as Canis lupus familiaris, the family or familiar wolf. They are wolves. They're not like wolves or close to wolves. They're wolves. So dogs don't come from coyotes. Dogs don't come from foxes. Those are all canids too. They're all in the dog family. But dogs specifically, what we did is we befriended wolves. We probably started off with wolf cubs that came out of a den and trained them and taught them and raised them with us. Some people think it's more that friendlier wolves amongst, individual wolves in a pack maybe started hanging out close to the camps to get food scraps, or be around whatever it is. We developed a hunting relationship with wolves.
Yeah.
Humans and wolves started to hunt together, and play that out over the course of 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, maybe more years, and you end up where people have Shih Tzus in their Manhattan townhouse.
Yes,
right?
Yes,
and it's a wolf. Okay.
Yeah.
So all of the domesticated species, and domesticated means of the house. So it's just Latin. You might know the word like a domicile is a word for someone's home, your house. You live in a domicile. Or when something's very domestic, it means at home. So domesticated means of the house. So the one way to think about it is a dog is the wolf of the house.
Yes.
Right? Now, if you look at any of the foods we eat, you're going to find something similar. So if you think about beef, probably the most common meat we're going to eat here in the US, or one of the most common, the animal that beef comes from originally, the cow comes from originally, I should say, the wild progenitor is called the oryx. This is like one of those animals that's painted all on the cave walls in France, by early humans. This thing had massive lateral horns, muscled like a giant bison. Very, very scary, intimidating animal that our ancestors out of Europe were hunting. And when I think about trying to bring one of those down with a spear, I mean, this is not like the lumbering dumb cow that we think of today. Like, very easy to walk up to a cow today and kill it if you wanted, but
Exactly.
not so the oryx. Similar, Sus scrofa, the pig, in its wild form, when we hunt pigs, we carry pistols as well as our rifles because a pig will turn and charge you. And if those two tusks go between your legs, they'll cut your femoral arteries. You'll bleed out right on the ground right there. I mean, that's a dangerous, big, powerful animal. I've personally hunted hogs that weigh over 400 pounds. I mean, they get gigantic. So they have a wild progenitor. That one that has no hair and is all pink with the little ears, that thing is the domesticated house form we've created with the curly little tail.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So here's something interesting about domestication is one of the trademarks of domestication is something called neoteny. So neo, like the word new. Neoteny is when in adulthood you carry on having characteristics of the child form or the juvenile form. So when a wolf puppy is born, it looks like a sweet little puppy. It has floppy ears. It has a curly tail. It's playful.
Exactly.
When a wolf grows up, it's not like that anymore. The ears point. The tail is straighter. This thing is not playful anymore. It's a hunter now, right? When we breed dogs, dogs end up being full-grown adults with curly tails and floppy ears and a puppy's demeanor even as adults. And you can see this in ourselves now. So if you were to go find like some tribal men from Papua New Guinea, let's say, who are still hunting and gathering in their traditional way in the jungle, and you put them up against a couple guys from New York City, those guys are going to look like they're grown-up size, but why are they like boys? They're hairless, they're all preened, they're skinny, right? They have like this childlike, they haven't matured into men because they're not in the same way that we don't want our dogs to. You don't want your dog to become a wolf.
No.
Society doesn't want men and women to become wild hunter-gatherers, right? It's not. So that's part of our domestication. Okay, so let me give you another example. We'll talk plants now just to kind of give some more perspective. So domestication probably began with grasses. It's probably why we have such a powerful association with lawns, right, in our yards.
Yes.
This obsession with grass. Like, what is that? Well, I'll give you a list of grasses that we eat today in our modern world. Wheat, barley, corn or maize, rice. The grains that form the cornerstone of all the diets in the developed world are all the seeds of grasses that we've domesticated.
Yeah.
So we've taken these things that we would have eaten as hunter-gatherers, but in very small amounts seasonally, and we've turned them into 50% of our diet or whatever portion they form by causing them to grow bigger seeds with more carbohydrates in them. We've done this with all of our fruits, and so you've got fruits that would have been very small and very tart become very large and very sugary. One of my favorite examples is with our vegetables, and that would be all of the brassicas. And so you have a plant in Europe called Brassica oleracea, which is a really small mustard family plant that you could eat in the wild, but it's small. It wouldn't have a lot of substance to it. But today we eat this plant in multiple forms that we think of as lots of different plants. So we eat it as its flowers we call cauliflower and broccoli, same plant.
Wow.
Its greens we eat as kale, collard, cabbage. Its stem is kohlrabi. It's broccolini. It's all of these. It's a whole suite of plants that we think of as all different. And that's very similar to what we see with dogs. You could go to breeders all over. You could find 500 varieties of dogs, but they're all gray wolves. And you could go into your supermarket and buy a week's worth of meals and get home and cook them and realize you ate the same vegetable every single night.
Yes.
That's what we've been doing. So we have only a small handful of foods that we've domesticated, and they form our whole diet, and none of them are found in nature in that form. So when people are like, well, I'm on a natural diet, it's like, nope, you're not. Or when they're like, like the paleo thing where it's like, oh, I'm doing a paleo diet. It's like, well, not really, because none of those foods used to exist. And that's okay, but if we don't know that, we get really confused, and you have all these people fighting over the same assemblage of foods rearranged as different diets, and that none of that makes sense.
Exactly.
So,
And what is the way? Like, what did you discover, and how did they do it? Like
okay,
the primal wild.
So we still have a handful of wild people on the planet, and those are hunter-gatherers. And I don't mean that as a derogatory thing at all. In fact, I mean it as a compliment. There are people in the world, not many left, but there's some in the Amazon, there's some in New Guinea, there's some in the subcontinent of Africa, off the coast of Africa. Off the coast of India, where you have people who still live these traditional uncontacted tribes, right?
Yes.
And that would be a great way of thinking, okay, that is the wild form of a human, and us in the cities living in houses are the domesticated form of a human.
Exactly.
And when we look at their diets, it's very interesting because, and I should say their diets and lifestyles, because it's not like diet's not the whole piece, right? Diet and lifestyle really go hand in hand, but they eat a considerable amount more species than we do. So you know how I said, like, you could eat kale one night, and the next night you have broccoli, the next night you have kohlrabi, the next night you have, cauliflower, the next night you have Brussels sprouts, and you're like,
and
I eat a different food every night, and you're eating only one food, one species. Well, they're eating something like 200 to 1,000 species a year.
Wow.
So when you think about it like that, if you thought about each species as like maybe as information, then it's like, oh, well, we're on a very information-poor diet. And the reason I say information is because it used to be that we understood a lot less about food. So the main thing we knew was, hey, there's carbohydrates, sugars. They come in long chains that are not so sweet and short individual, saccharide molecules that are very sugary and sweet, but they're all carbohydrates. And there's lipids, and of course there's lots of kinds. You have polyunsaturated lipids and saturated lipids, but they're all fats. So we have protein, fat. We have, fat, sugar, and then of course proteins, which are made of amino acids. We knew that. And then alcohol is actually the fourth very commonly consumed macronutrient because it's got 7 calories per gram. So you've got these 4 macronutrients, right, that everybody's was aware of. But we didn't know about vitamins and minerals, really. And then we got it. So we knew about what are called macronutrients. But then we learned, there's micronutrients. It matters. I need all these different vitamins, and I need all these different minerals. That was seems obvious to you and I today, but there was a time where that was revolutionary new knowledge in the science of nutrition.
Yeah, that's why now everyone takes supplements, like 10 pills a day.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of getting it from food.
And then we started to learn there was more. We learned, there's all these phytochemicals, for instance, like we need all of these different terpenes and all of these different antioxidants and all of these things. So now we know about that. Where it's headed is towards nutrigenomics, which is an understanding that the genome of what we eat actually impacts our epigenome. So our genetic expression is influenced by the genes of what we eat. And that today sounds like science fiction, but in 20 years, that'll be in textbooks. So that's where the science is going. So if you think about it in those terms, it's like, wait a second, if I'm only eating like 30 species a year, and hunter-gatherers are eating hundreds of species a year, does that have an impact on me? Am I deficient in species? And the problem is, you couldn't go to the supermarket and fix that problem because in the supermarket, there's only a handful of species. You can find hundreds of boxes, but we all know it's all corn and wheat. A handful of fats, and it's all the same stuff, just repackaged a million ways. It's like there's 26 letters in the alphabet, but you can write literally endless books out of that. And that's kind of what we're doing.
Exactly.
And another way to think about that is like, if each species that you hunt or gather is a living creature, because it is. I mean, it's obvious if it's like a deer, it's like, oh, yeah, that's obviously a living creature. But what about a mushroom? Well, that's a living creature it's basically the sex organ of a mycelia. So it's a fungus, it's a living organism. If I pull a clam or a snail or an apple or a piece of wild lettuce, like these are all individual organisms. And hunter-gatherers know, and I say know the way you know your husband, or you know your wife, or you know your friends, or you know your parents, they know hundreds of species personally. So personally that they ingest them and build their own bodies out of those creatures.
Wow, so interesting.
But we know almost no species.
No, and
We
there's
know
no way.
dogs and cats. We know a handful of, domesticated foods that most of
Yeah.
us wouldn't recognize. Like most people will know what an apple is, but if you took them out to an apple tree that didn't have any apples on it, they probably wouldn't recognize the apple tree unless you
No,
showed them,
not at
right?
all. Not at
Yep.
all.
If you brought them out to a lettuce plant that had grown beyond, harvest stage and it was just full grown, almost nobody, unless they garden, will know what that is. So even though we eat these things, we don't know them anymore.
We don't
And
know
so
what it is.
right. So now what that means is that we are a very lonely species. Very lonely because we share a planet that had all these species to get to know, and we've chosen not to know any of them. And the ones that we did want to get to know were only the ones we could change into what we wanted them to become. And then we just started to kind of like push everything else out and away. And then we sit in our living rooms and watch David Attenborough documentaries going like, wow, that stuff's out there? Cool. Very weird situation. So I think of humans
Very
today,
weird.
if you compared like a hunter-gatherer, if you went out with a hunter-gatherer, if you went out with me into my woods here and you started to do this thing, people do this to me all the time. What's that? What's that? What's that? I will know some stuff, but I'll not know more than I'll know. If you go with a hunter-gatherer out into their environment, you would have a very hard time finding something they don't know. Because they've always known it for thousands of generations. This information you just grow up in it. So you know all the species. But we're not like that. For us, I'll stop talking here in a second, but for us, I think we are a lot like an astronaut who landed on another planet and is like, the environment to us is like a scary foreign place.
Exactly.
We watch shows about people trying to survive out there. We're all nervous about what would happen if we got trapped out there. We don't know what to eat. We don't know how to make a fire. We don't know what water to drink. We're from this planet, but we act like people who arrived from another planet, and we think we need like a 50-liter pack full of equipment to survive out there because we've gotten so estranged from the world we live in. And that's why it's going to be so easy for us to go into a virtual reality, because at least in the virtual reality, it's all stuff we made and we understand and we know what to do with, because that other natural world out there is kind of scary to us.
Wow, I'm literally like mind blown, because it's true. And the worst part is that if I think like, oh, what can I do to like change these things? It's impossible. I can't.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. It can be a little overwhelming.
I can't change anything. And like, I always say that, everything depends on execution. Like everyone has ideas, but everything depends on how you execute the ideas. And like, I feel, well, for me, I see you and I'm like, wow, I wish I lived like you, and you actually executed that life for you. You live in the wild and you do all these things.
Bumbled into it. Was not execution.
Yeah.
Bumbled and stumbled into it,
How did you do it? Like,
yeah, I mean, like the way you'd learn anything. Well, I didn't go to high school and I didn't go to college. So like I mentioned to you, I was thinking about these things as a young person when a lot of other people were thinking about other things. And that's not all good. There's a lot of things I wish I had done that I didn't do, my wife, for instance, had an incredible athletic background. And I grew up thinking like athletics were for jocks. I wasn't interested in it. I was more intellectual. I just didn't care about that. But now in my 40s, I look at her and I think like, wow, I wish I had learned those lessons of discipline and teamwork and, how to be appropriate in an environment of people who are all struggling together for a common goal. And I didn't learn any of those lessons. I know how to survive out in my woods. That's awesome. But it's, all the time that I invested into that is time other people were investing into other things, which are valuable too. So,
yes.
You know what I mean? I think we all have gleaned lessons from the life we lived. And I'm sure you can only have so many interests and actually nurture them all. So
Yeah.
I just want to be clear, like I'm blessed to have the skill set I have, but I gave up things to have it because I chased this. I was in the woods doing all these things and not doing other things, which are also important. So to say
Yeah.
that first, but yeah, piece by piece. And I always say, it's kind of like if you move to a new town and you first walk out onto the streets of that town, it's like everyone's a stranger to you, and it
Yeah.
feels pretty alienating. You can't go make 50 friends at once, so what do? You go make friends one at a time. Connect with people one at a time, and you make a new network. Well, it's like that. If I walk into the woods, it's a wall of green. It's like, what is all this stuff? You got to meet these plants one at a time. You meet mushrooms one at a time. You meet animals one at a time. I mean, you can't expect to get a birding book and go learn 50 birds that week. It's like one at a time. And if you want to have those relationships to be meaningful, then you need to spend time with each one, right? So,
Yeah.
an example, I find the idea of eating acorns fascinating. Acorns are the fruits of oak trees. And they are a food that was very important all around the world before grains were domesticated. Acorns are really cool. They're pretty big. They've got fats, protein, and carbohydrate. They're extremely nourishing. They're complete proteins. But you can't pick one up, open it, and just eat it. Well, you mechanically can, but you won't derive much nutrition from it. In fact, it's full of anti-nutrients in the form of tannins. Tastes terrible. For me to turn an acorn with my normal process that I do into food takes 10 days. So I got to go harvest those acorns. I got to dry them. I got to crack them. I got to then grind them to powder and leach them in water, changing the water over and over and over again for 10 days. And then I have a flour that's food, okay?
Wow, it's a big process.
It's a big process. People didn't used to do this alone, by the way. You know, we love these TV shows where people try to survive alone in the woods. I mean, that is not how humans do it. Humans do it in groups of 30 to 50 people. That's how
nobody
you survive.
Was alone. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like packs in the tribe.
Yeah, tribes, yeah. And so you'd have a foraging group, 30 to 50 people. They're part of a larger tribal group who's part of a larger language group. And so, you know, and it's not like we imagine, like, now we understand that North America, for instance, when Europeans got here, was completely peopled from one end to the other. It wasn't like we have a cultural memory of a lot of empty space because so many people died from smallpox and other diseases that by the time Europeans started to explore North America, it felt kind of empty, but it hadn't been empty. It had been empty because you had the first wave of Europeans got to the coast, interacted with native people, inadvertently passed the diseases, left, went back to Europe. 20, 30 years later, as people are coming in and moving in, those diseases have been moving through for decades, killing so many people. It felt like open space. It wasn't. So nowhere in the world was. Human beings are amazing. We live everywhere. And so we have never lived alone. In fact, banishment was always like the worst punishment, right? You get kicked out into the wilderness on your own. You're basically dead.
Exile,
can't live like
the
that.
worst. Yeah.
Yeah. Like if I'm going to process acorns, I mean, I want a group of people. It's a lot of work. You know, breaking down, I had the opportunity to break down a bison, shoot and, you know, kill and butcher a bison.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
How big? Wow.
Couple thousand pounds. I mean, it's a lot of work. You want a group of people who are good at that, and you all just do it together. But anyway, my point. So getting to work with acorns, I've got to first identify oak trees. So I become familiar with not just what do oak trees look like, you know, what's their bark like, what's their leaves like. What about when there's no leaves and I'm out in its fall time or it's winter time? Now I'm looking up at the skyline and I'm learning what the branchlets look like against the sky, like, because they're all different in all species. So you're like, oh, that's an oak. Okay. But then it's also like, it's not just that. It's like, where do oaks like to be? Because I'm not going to find them in a swamp, you know? So you start learning like what kind of habitat, you don't, not even necessarily on purpose, just over time, you just start. Then it's like, what species of oak? Because I eat mostly acorns from black oaks, but you can eat them from white oaks. There's hundreds and hundreds of oak species. So over time, you get to know these things and you're working with those acorns. You learn all these little details. And one day you're like, oh, I know oaks pretty well now. It's kind of like the first
Yeah.
time you hang out with somebody, you don't necessarily know them that well, but after 30 times of going out and having drinks or going out for food or going out to exercise or whatever you do, you get to see them in different contexts, you get to know them, and eventually you get a pretty good handle on who they are. That's how, one by one, that's how you learn. And
I
so
love your
in
analogies. I love your analogies with
Thank you.
everything.
Thank you. So one by one. So and another way that I learned, and this isn't everybody's path, is I would get books and use the internet, and sometimes it would be something I saw that I was like, man, that looks like you could eat it, but I don't know what it is. Go figure out what it is. Or in the other direction, I'm looking in a book at something, and it's like, I'd like to find that. How do
Yeah.
I go find that? And then it was workshops, working with other foragers who teach classes and doing plant walks or going out with other hunters to learn. That was harder for me. Plants were a lot easier, came very natural to me. Hunting, I started to learn in my late 30s. This is a thing that people typically learned in childhood because they grew up around, usually it's a dad or an uncle or a grandfather, but obviously it can be a mother or an aunt too, but it's typically a patrilineal thing that is passed on. But I didn't have that. I didn't have a dad. So trying to learn that in my late 30s, that was challenging.
Amazing.
But piece by piece, and too, like from podcasting. So I podcasted on the topic, and that's like going to college. I mean, you just get to interview people who are like professors in their craft over and over again. After a while, you become an expert yourself. And so, doing that, working with lots of different people. Now I make a television show about it, so I have the opportunity to be with people who are experts in their area, because obviously I can't know every environment, it's like
That's amazing.
piece by piece is how I learned. And so I always tell people, it's like that old saying, how do you eat an elephant? It's like one bite at a time, right? You can't, if you look at the whole thing, like, how am I going to learn all this? Oh, it's too overwhelming. So piece by piece, one at a time.
Oh my God, it's amazing to talk to you, and I have so many questions, but I'm going to make 2 more questions.
Oh, please.
One is and how do you eat in terms of like the fasting and all these things that they say now? Is it good to like eat little amounts more often, or to eat once every now and then a big meal? Like how is your diet in terms of this?
I don't know that I'm the super qualified to answer what other people should do.
No, what do you do? I'm curious.
Yeah. So I used to be somebody who liked longer periods of time without food, but now I'm very athletic, and I'm one of those people now who eats like every 2 hours. I'm eating pretty frequently. I do a smoothie every morning for breakfast, and that's the place where I get to really like, with my blender concoct like my perfect
I do
potion.
a smoothie too. Yeah, I do a smoothie too.
I've been into that. Like my first business project was a DVD called Elixir Craft, and I was doing like smoothie DVDs and stuff, 20 years ago. So I still do that. I love to do that. And that allows me to tuck certain things into my diet that are kind of hard to sit down to and eat, So I do that in the morning. From then till lunch, I'm cool to just sort of snack on leftovers or stuff we have in the kitchen. And at dinner, I cook in our house. So I always cook whole food meals at night that are going to be some meat that almost always something that we've harvested ourselves or comes from my wife is a teacher. And so she barters teaching, private teacher. So she barters some teaching with a local farm here. And so we get produce from there as well. So I'll cook, basically vegetables, meat, and some kind of carbohydrate, very simple, classic kind of whole food meals at night. And then, I'm a lot of water through the day. I'm really big on that.
Yeah.
I'm big into saunas and things like that too. And I'm a very obsessive about cardiovascular exercise. So I'm sweating a lot in the day. So a lot of water and a lot of salt, very big on salt. I think, there's so many things we don't know about food because of the industrial food system. Yeah. So if you were going to assemble your diet from whole ingredients, not you personally, but I'm just saying as a person, if a person is going to just start with like, let me give you a little background here too. I spent 10 years as a raw food vegan. There was many years of that where I was so hardcore about that I didn't eat oils. They were too processed for me. So I wouldn't eat olive oil. I wouldn't eat salt. I wouldn't eat I'm talking fruit and nuts for years. I ate like that. I mean, I can't even
Wow.
believe I did it. Looking back, I don't think it's a good
Wow.
idea. I don't recommend it, but I was really drawn into that kind of concept. And one of the things you learn when you disassemble your diet down to its barest parts is like, oh, I have no idea how much salt I need to eat, because all the processed food has so much salt, you never have to think about it.
Yeah.
But when you look at people, indigenous people who are living, let's say you have a continent like North America, you're going to have people on the coasts who have access to shellfish, who have access to salt deposits and salt water. And then you're going to have people inland who have access to things like bison and deer. And they'll create trade routes because the people inland need stuff from the sea, seaweeds,
Yeah.
salt, and they'll trade to get those things. We're like an ocean inside a skin. So if you're going to create your diet from scratch, it can be stunning how much salt an active person actually needs to consume. And so we forget that because we're used to processed foods.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of little details like that. Another component would be people who eat a really high produce diet might not need nearly as much water as somebody who's eating all kinds of cooked, boxed, packaged foods. That food's very dehydrated. Even if it's like moist, it's not as wet as celery or a cucumber or fruits. So there's these little things that we just grew up never thinking about because it was all, they imagine like they fortify salt in this country with iodine because people were so iodine deficient, they were developing goiters.
Wow,
They
that's crazy.
fortify milk in the United States with vitamin D because kids in the cities, basically a city can be thought of as an artificial canyon because the buildings are like high walls like a canyon. So kids inside the cities were developing rickets. In adults, when you have a vitamin D deficiency, it's called osteomalacia. It's like bone pain. But for kids, they get soft bones and they would get bow legs. So our diet started to be fortified, the milk fortified with vitamin D, right? So you have all these examples. If you were to go buy a box of pasta or a loaf of bread and you flip it over, oh, they put all these B vitamins in there. What's happening? We're like animals in a factory farm whose diets are being supplemented so that we don't perish from diseases of malnutrition.
That's crazy.
Right? So we are like farm animals in a way.
Yeah.
And that's hard to change, by the way. I think this is what I always say. Imagine the difference. I know I got way away from your question, but I'll just wrap this up.
No, I love this.
If you imagine the difference between a farm and a zoo, it's really instructive because a farm is a place where you raise plants or animals, kill them really young to turn them into a product.
Yeah.
So you don't go to a farm looking for a 10-year-old cow to eat. You're eating a 1 or 2-year-old cow. You're eating a 6-month-old chicken. You're eating the young, tender flower of a broccoli. Not once it's all opened and the flowers have come out. It's not food anymore. When you go to a zoo, it's the opposite. They're not produce, right? The idea is keep these animals alive as long as possible and try to take their enclosure, even though they are locked in, try to take that pen and make it look like their natural habitat. Put rocks in there, put plants in there, put water in there. Try to feed them the healthiest diet you can so they're healthy and they live a long time.
But it's fake.
It's fake, but it's better than being in a factory farm.
Yes.
Okay, we aren't in a position right now where we can go all live in the wild, right? So I would rather be in a zoo than be in a factory farm.
Yes.
But a human zoo would mean we would need our homes and our built environments to start to resemble our natural environment more. We would need shoes that were shaped like our feet and not shaped like the opposite of a foot, right? We would need to be able to move and express ourselves on surfaces that aren't flat and 90-degree angles everywhere and little boxes. That's the factory farm that we live in. We need to change our world into something that's more like a zoo where the goal is to live a long time, to replicate our natural diet and our natural environment. And is it total freedom? No, but it's freer than free range.
Completely.
And free range is freer than a factory. And so I think that it's not perfect, but it would be better to think like, hey, how do we turn this into a zoo? Because this factory farming of people thing sucks. And we obviously don't get sold off for meat. We get sold off for our data. We get sold off for our labor. We get sold off for our tax money. That's the product that we produce. And it's not human. It's not focused on our flourishing. It's focused on trying to kind of extract produce from us. So
squeeze
I would,
us
yeah,
until
I
we
would
have
lean us towards
nothing
like
left.
I mean,
Yeah,
I don't want to be that bleak, but yeah, kind of,
exactly.
right? And then at the end, you get to be, I call it get to be tired again, retired. So we call it. It's
Yeah,
like, wait, retired? Like I'm tired and now I'm tired again? Like retired? What? Um, but
exactly.
but it's a really interesting phenomena here that we have created diets for ourselves that have to be fortified with synthetic vitamins because we don't have enough in the food we're eating. That's We treat factory farmed animals better sometimes than we treat ourselves.
Wow, it's crazy. Talking to you is mind blowing, incredible. And Daniel, my last question to you is, where do you see the future of foraging and the wild food consumption? Like, where is this all heading? Do you think it's going to be more and more? Because also the world is going to get like more digitalized, and or the other way around?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's been a really big uptick in interest in it. And I, those of us in the wild food community, we really saw it happen around COVID, where I think, growing up, I remember you'd occasionally meet elders who had lived through the Great Depression in the United States. And I don't know if you're old enough to remember this, but there was always like a joke about those kind of people because they wouldn't ever throw anything away. They save everything, right? Because they'd lived during a time where there was nothing available. And I think in a similar way, people are not going to soon forget going to the supermarket and there not being anything on shelves. That was like a kind of a shocking thing, or where it was like huge shortages of things that were common commodities suddenly. And finding out too that like it's as easy as just telling you you're not allowed to go out to stores anymore, or like now we all know that can happen.
Yeah.
And you can't forget that. So that's led a lot of people to say, hey, I'd like to just have even if it's not a real food security, it gives you a sense of empowerment to even know one thing you can eat in your environment. Like if you could walk out into your backyard and be like, because even in New York, like for instance, you're in New York City, you could go work with Steve Brill and his daughter there, right? They do wild food walks in Central Park, and you can learn to forage in the city. In fact, sometimes foraging in the city is awesome because there's so many horticultural species that have been planted that produce fruits and vegetables and even drugs. I mean,
so interesting.
Pretty wild. So I think that one component of the growth is people who remember what happened recently and they're looking to learn a little bit more. Then I think you have this side that's disillusioned with the direction society's going in. And so there's this sort of back to the land, back to farming. You probably see all the lumbersexual guys there, like in New York, who are, it's flannel shirts and beards are popular now. And it's this looking like you're this rugged outdoorsman, even if you're not, it's like fashion. Because
like a Viking.
What do you call it?
Like a Viking. Like
I think that we have a desire, a lot of us, to have that sense of self-sufficiency and some control in our lives because we truly feel like we don't have much. So that's driving some people to wild foods. Hunting is similar. I think a lot of people are going, wow, I don't like buying meat that has been tortured. It's just terrible. But I also don't want to be a vegetarian. So I guess maybe I should go try to kill my own food or something, or go fishing or something. So you've got all these different ways people are being drawn in. And I think one big one now is social media, AI, fake everything. It's just like, oh man, I just want to connect to something real. So all that's pulling people in. The confounding force to that is the big picture politics that we see. And I'm not talking like right, left in the United States, but I'm talking like World Economic Forum, UN, World Health Organization. These folks have this idea in mind of what they think of as like a utopia, but to most of us sounds like a horrible dystopia. And part of that is the idea of like 15-minute cities. And that's like, smart cities where everything you need is within 15 minutes walking. So you never have to leave the city. And in fact, you need a permit is the idea to leave. Or if you wanted to go into nature, you need a permit. And it's like restricting us, and it will be sold under the idea that humans are so bad for the environment. Do Did you experience things during COVID that you saw with your own eyes, but you were told like isn't what was happening? Like you get one story, right? Like I remember you'd watch the news and they were saying one thing, and then you'd go out and you'd see something totally different.
Yeah, and I was the first part of COVID, I was in my country in Argentina, which was even worse than here.
Okay.
Because like the government was saying things and you could see like how big of a lie and
Right.
corruption there was because they
Right.
were just trying to control us for people
Okay.
not to work.
So now fast forward 25, 30 years, okay? So there'll be all these kids who are going to read textbooks about what that pandemic was like. And they're all that's going to be recorded is all the stuff that ended up in the news. Because I would be like, why is the news pumping out articles that we all know are untrue? And then it's like, oh, for posterity. Because in 30 years,
They're gonna
that's
study
all
that.
that's going to be. That's going to be the record. It makes me wonder a lot, like, what was it actually like during the 1917 and 18 flu? What was it like during the Great Depression? What really happened in World War I and World War II? Because now I see how easy you can fake history by just pumping out tons of content so that that's all that's left. And any voices of people saying, hey, that's not true. We all got canceled. We were all shut down. Our stuff was taken off the internet. So it didn't make sense at the time, but down the road, there'll be a story of this pandemic and how it played out that we'll all know if we're still alive. That's not quite it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that the story that's going to happen, like right now, we're seeing all over the world tremendous amount of movement of refugees from different parts of the world into different countries, right?
Yeah.
That's going to be down the road. The history books are going to say those were all climate refugees. That the climate crisis had become so bad, we were on the brink of destroying the earth. So we had to create these 15-minute cities. We had to create permitting to go into nature. Everyone had to change their lifestyle and eat bugs and breathe out of cans and all these things that are these dystopian ideas for the future.
Yes.
They don't make sense from us looking at it. We're like, dude, I go outside. Everything's fine. What are you talking about? But it'll all be worked into the history books that we had to do this. So I think what you have right now is a diametric opposition where you have the human spirit is wanting more nature, is wanting more real, is wanting more connection again, and all of that. But there's diabolical forces at work that want less of that for all of us. And I don't know what will happen, but I know that those of us wanting to go into nature are going to butt up against those who want us out of nature. And how that plays out, I don't know. It's going to be very fascinating, but it's all starting. Like for those of us who are paying attention to it, it's very obvious. I mean, it used to be like, oh, it's a conspiracy. Now it's like, no, you can listen to them say it. You know, they're saying it out loud. So if that makes sense, like those forces want us to not eat meat anymore. Those forces want us to eat bugs instead. You know, those forces don't want you to have any control over what's on your produce. They don't, and those forces have been buying up all the farmland and arable land and all of that because they want control of the food supply and all of that. So I don't think that if we are able to create some kind of healthy utopia on Earth, it's not going to be without a fight. I mean, we have a lot of difficult times ahead. I think that we're in the early stages, like this really uncomfortable moment in history that we're all going through. It's like, I mean, the stuff going on in the news today as we're sitting here is
very
so overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
But we're at the beginning of that. We're not even in the middle. So let's say it's 2016 to 2036 or something, you know, or whatever this awful period. Always gets better, but we're in the beginning of it getting worse. And so I don't think we're going to see resolution on this right away. I do think what's important is that people who are interested in any of these kind of skills immerse themselves in them so that they're not lost. Because if we have a generation that goes fully digital, you can lose information so fast. I mean, you know, it's interesting if you go down like, well, you're from Argentina, so, you know, it's like time I've spent down in the jungle in Peru, for instance, and you see things going on that you're like, oh, it'd only take one generation to lose all of this knowledge.
Exactly.
You know, and so I think that it's important that we try to remember and learn as much as we can and keep passing that stuff on. It's going to be really important.
Yeah, and thank God people like you that promote these kind of things and show it to the world for real.
I mean, everybody's doing their part. You know, you're doing your part, I'm doing my part. I mean, we're all just sharing from whatever gift we have. And like I was saying, to bring it kind of full circle, anything I'm sharing is coming from a person who's been traumatized and beat up and barely made it, and has a lot of personal flaws, that are I'm doing a lot more work on myself than I am on foraging. It's like,
Yeah, everyone, me too, every day.
yeah, well, I think that's my point, is like wounded healers, it's kind of how it's not a bunch of people who have it all together who are out there making this, making change. It's all of us who got here because we were kind of messed up and kicked around, who started to be like, how do I pick myself up out of this situation? And that, it's amazing how much that, like, whenever people go like, wow, I've been helped by your work, I'm always like, wow, that's cool, because I was just trying to like fix myself,
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that it's cool that those things aren't mutually exclusive, that if you focus on fixing yourself and becoming healthy inside and out, the ripple effect on that's tremendous. And what I can't stand, honestly, I really just can't stand, is like activism, where you have people who are out there trying to fix other people who are so messed up themselves.
Exactly.
Most of the activists that I see are like terribly messed up people, and they're telling other people how to live, and it's like, whoa, brother, whoa, sister, like, you need to fix you. You don't have any sense of what you need to tell people. But those people have platforms right now, and they're loud. So, I don't think that you fix the outside and then you get better. It's like you fix you and the outside gets better.
Amazing. I completely agree with you. And thank you so much, Daniel, for this. I really enjoyed our talk so much, and I've learned so much, and congratulations on everything you do.
Thanks.
And thank you for doing what you do and sharing this with the world, because it's truly like remarkable, and we need this as the human race.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your platform with me, and thank you to everybody listening for making it this far in the interview. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you all for joining us on another episode of Fill the Void. We truly appreciate your questions. Send us an email at roberta@fillthevoid.club.
Or simply comment below.
How do you identify with this episode?